Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to give you a super quick crash course and my quick tips for PHD2 Autoguiding. I'm going to tell you basically what it is, how it works, and how you can optimize your setup to try and get the best autoguiding possible. What autoguiding is a form of active control for your telescope mount. You will have a secondary camera and it will be on a guide scope or an OAG like back here. And it's going to watch the movement of the stars, and it's going to provide a closed loop feedback to your mount about the real-time position, well, almost real-time position of the star. And what you're going to do from that information of the position of the star is send a corrective signal to your mount. And your mount is going to attempt to return that star back to the center point where it should be to get the sharpest images possible. And this becomes pretty necessary to do for almost any astrophotography setup. There are ways to shoot without an auto guider, but I find oftentimes they're significantly more difficult than just throwing on a simple auto guider to your setup. So without further ado, I'm going to show you guys my observatory computer. I'm going to show you how I have my PhD set up, and we're going to use that to describe some of the features of PhD and what you need to be looking out for. Alrighty guys, so here we are inside of my observatory computer. I have SGP, I've got the SkyX, I'm using a Paramount Mighty, and of course I've got PHD2 running the guiding. So the first thing you'll notice right off the bat is we have this old window here. That's where your stars are going to pop up. That's where you'll be able to, select a star, click on one, or just automatically select multiple stars, what have you. You'll notice here on the bottom window, this is the guide graph. And I know a lot of you just really love staring at this for hours and hours, but I encourage you to not stare at this too much. The other thing I usually like to have on my setup is I will display the star profile, and I use that to just kind of see if the star is saturated or not. The window is a little janky on my computer, but well, I use that to basically look at a star. So here in the PHD2 window, we have the graph, we have the window. I like to hold the star profile to see what the stars look like. And of course, we have the graph on the bottom. So when you're auto guiding, there's things you need to keep in mind, what you're trying to fight, what you're working with, and how are you going to accomplish getting smooth stars. So there are two things you're combating when you're trying to auto guide. You are first off combating your seeing, and this is just, dependent on what the sky is like in your local conditions. The stars will move around, and the centroid of the stars, or basically their midpoint, is going to be a lot less stable. So your reference for tracking and getting a smooth exposure isn't going to be as stable, and that will be reflected in your actual images. The other sources of error that you're attempting to combat come from your mount, and also potentially from your tripod. Things like tripod sync, vibration could potentially be a thing. You've also got polar alignment error, backlash, periodic errors, stiction, all kinds of sources of mechanical error that you can attempt to guide out, or purchase a really expensive mount that doesn't have those things, but that's not always an option now, is it? So you have all of these sources of error. The question becomes to you is, how can you get rid of them practically? And the first thing that I would recommend to you is to see what they look like. So you can actually watch in real time what your native guide errors and mechanical errors look at, simply by turning on your auto guider and disabling the mount output. And we do that here in PhD by clicking the brain. We go into guiding and we uncheck enable mount guide output. And what that's going to do is actually let you see all of these errors that you're attempting to remove, and it helps give you a much better idea of what you're up against. It's going to be different for every single mount. Something like an AM5 or an HEM27, a harmonic drive mount, is going to exhibit a lot more periodic error, which will manifest as a sine wave in your right ascension graph. And I should actually dive into that a bit more. So you will notice here, there's two lines on this axis that describe our error. And what those are red for DEC and blue for RA. And the way that PhD knows which direction of star movement corresponds to which axes comes from your actual calibration. So if you've ever wondered what PHD2 calibration is doing, it's taking the centroid of the star, it's moving your mount in RA, and then it's moving it in DEC. And then from this, it determines how a star movement corresponds to which axis of your mount. So for example, if your camera is at perfectly perpendicular angle, side to side would be RA, up and down would be deck. It might actually be perpendicular to that. But you can look at your calibration data by going to Tools and Review Calibration Data. And here you can actually see how good of a result you got from your calibration, which if you have a bad calibration, it can actually propagate into some bad errors for your guiding, because of course you need to accurately know which direction of star movement means what to your auto guider, because the stars are going to be bouncing all around and you need good calibration data to be sure that things are moving in the right direction. And the way that you know if your calibration data is good is basically by how orthogonal the two calibration lines are in the graph. So here you can see my mount's calibration error, which is it describes the star position as it moves in the screen corresponding to which axis. So you can see if my star goes a bit up and to the right, that's going to be directly corresponding to deck, and down and to the right, directly corresponding to RA. So from this, it knows what star movement corresponds to which thing and how it's going to actually correct that out. And a lot of people have misconceptions about when you actually need to recalibrate your guider. The only time you ever need to recalibrate your auto guider is when there is a rotation between your guide camera and your guiding imaging plane. So let's say in my OAG, I twisted my camera a certain angle. I think if you go above 30 degrees, control becomes unstable. So just by twisting the camera, that is going to modify our calibration data. If you leave your guide camera set up at the exact same angle every time, you don't need to be recalibrating every time you go out and shoot, because this physical relationship between the movement of the stars and where it is on what axis hasn't actually changed. The only way to change it is by changing the angle. So that's what calibration is. That's what you need to keep in mind. And once you have your calibration, then you can start to make a bit more sense of these lines or errors on your guide graph. So like I said before, I recommend you turn it off. I recommend you click find a star and you watch the movement of a star or multiple stars. I always recommend doing multi-star guiding because it averages out the seeing error that you're also trying to combat. Ideally, you don't want to combat it, but with sometimes the right equipment, you can attempt to combat it. But in most cases, don't try and fight the seeing. You can average out the seeing error with longer exposures or using multiple stars, because that's going to get a more averaged location of the centroid of the image or of a star, if you have multiple to average from, of course. So once you have that going, turn your guiding off and watch your graph. What you're going to notice is two things. You're going to see a manifestation of your polar alignment error in the red line, which is the deck line. This will come off of the midline from your graph in a downward or upward linear line. And that is basically your polar alignment error. So the polar alignment error manifests as a slow drift in the declination axis, which is great because it is only going in one direction. Now, the physical bumpiness of this line, if it's going like really staticky up in one direction, that's from your seeing pretty much only. So the better your seeing is, the more smooth the line graph will be. But the worse your polar alignment error, the higher the slope of this red line will be as it comes off of the midline or the midpoint of where you want to be auto guiding. So if you have any doubts about your polar alignment error, you can actually see the slope of the error by watching this red line. And that is also how drift alignment works, by measuring the slope of your deck axis error, which is directly corresponding to your polar alignment, which is very cool. Now, some things you're going to have to fight with in the declination axis are backlash. Backlash is the main thing to worry about in the red line when you're guiding. If you have backlash, what you don't want to do is overshoot the midpoint. If you think about it, the error you're trying to resolve in deck is just a straight line. You should only ever have to correct in the opposite direction that your red line is sloping away from. You want to only be pulsing. If it's going up, you only want to be pulsing down. There should never be any situation in which you're going the opposite direction, because when you go the opposite direction with a lot of mounts, you're going to start encountering backlash. So it's going to say, go up, go up, go up. And then slowly over time, as the integral portion of the control program notices that you're building up a lot of time not going in the right direction because of seeing or whatever, it's going to increase the intensity of these pulses to try and bring it somewhere that it's not supposed to go. And that's why the deck line usually uses the resist switch algorithm for auto guiding. And what resist switch is basically, it's a form of control, but you don't want to switch directions that you're auto guiding in. You want to resist the switch. Because if you come across a point where you're needing to switch, more often than not, with most mounts, for most people, you're going to have backlash, and that's not good. That's basically all you're going to be fighting with the red line. You can sometimes encounter stiction, which is like a evil version of backlash if you have things over tightened on your mount. I don't remember what that manifests like, but it can be a problem as well. So where things get more complex with your auto guiding is when you're looking at the errors that are present within the blue line or the right ascension line. These errors can differ a lot depending on what mount you're using and can be a bit more complex to guide out. And for that reason, PHD2 gives us some extra tools to try and combat such things along with, the seeing. In the blue line or the right ascension line for your telescope, the errors that are typically going to be present are periodic error, seeing, and those are pretty much the only ones, as well as any kind of tracking bumps. If your mount is combating poor balance, that's going to be reflected in your auto guiding graph. So there's going to be like balance error, there's going to be periodic error, there's going to be the seeing, and any other kind of deflections that pop up. So what that's going to end up looking like for you is a sine wave. And the question becomes, is how do you turn a sine wave into a flat line? Now, the great thing about a sine wave is that it's predictable. And if you know something about its history, then you can correct its future. And that's the function of the hysteresis control method for PHD, is it's going to account for some information in the guide curves past and use that to properly react to guiding errors in the future. And that's why people use hysteresis most of the time, is because as you're trying to combat the sine wave, this is kind of the best method to actually deal with it usually. And for most people, this is what I would recommend you just stick with. There are some fancier options like the Z filter, or there's predictive PEC. Both of those can be okay options, but it again depends on what mount you have. If you have a harmonic drive mount, it might be worth looking into predictive PEC, but hysteresis will maintain some information about the periodic error, probably not as well as predictive PEC, but again, an option to think about. So for the hysteresis controller in PHD2 and for the resist switch control for deck axis, you have a couple different options that you can end up tuning. And there's a couple different ways to go about finding what parameters you should actually have for each controller. So you can either use the guiding assistant, which is going to recommend you some okay starting point numbers. You just have to run it on a star for a given amount of time, probably 2 or 3 minutes. And it's gonna recommend to you some guiding settings based on what errors it sees. And that's what I'm recommending to do manually anyways. Guiding assistant is like an automated method of doing what I was suggesting, which is turn off your guide graph output and just watch what happens when your mount is left to its own devices. What can it do by itself? The settings that you have at your disposal to tune the aggression, the hysteresis, the minimum movement, and the max RA and maximum dec. What the aggression is a multiplier percentage of how much of this pulse do you actually want to make to correct the mount. So the aggression is something that you're going to be tuning probably quite a bit. The way that you know that you have the correct aggression is that your mount won't do an overshoot. And what an overshoot is when your autoguider is making pulses. Say your line is going down like this, it makes a pulse. If your aggression is too large, your line of error is going to overshoot in the other direction. You'll cross the midline and you'll have to make a corrective pulse to bring it back down. And that's bad. We don't want to induce guiding errors by our own guiding settings. So what you want to be looking out for as you're auto guiding is whether or not your corrections are leading to overshoots. And if you're leading to overshoots, then that's a bad time. You want to bring that number down lower and lower. And this number is going to differ for every single mount depending on what you have. For this system that I'm displaying here, I'm using a Paramount Mighty and I have a ZWO 30mm guide cam on it. And what I've determined is an aggression of about 73 is sufficient to not cause overshoots. And you can see that here in my guide graph. If my line deviates in RA, it is pushed back up, but not over the midline, causing an overshoot. So you just want to watch that number and make sure you're not overshooting. The next value that you'll have at your disposal to change for RA is the hysteresis setting. So what the hysteresis setting is a percentage value that reflects how much of past guiding corrections should be included into your current or future guiding corrections. So let's say you've had a number of corrections in the past that reflect your periodic error. How is PHD2 going to look at those past corrections and determine what needs to be done for the current guiding error? So typically, if you have a hysteresis of 10, which is the default, it will consider its correction is 10% reflecting the history of your guide graph and 90% of what the real-time error is for your star. So typically you just leave it at 10. There's no need to really adjust it. The greater you increase this percentage value, the more it's going to consider the history into the correction that it makes now, which can be a bad thing because it can force it to not be responsive to fast changes that are happening. Just leave it at 10 and that should be good enough. The next parameter that you're going to see is for both DEC and for RA, and this is the minimum movement parameter. And what this is basically the minimum distance required before PHD determines that a correction is going to need to be made for your guide graph. And this is going to change for every setup depending on the focal length, the polar alignment error, all kinds of different things about your system. You will tune this to reflect the best way to solve the errors in your system. And you can determine this, again, from the guiding assistant in PHD2, or you could watch the graph yourself. I tend to just watch the graph myself because I feel like I can do a better job with my trained eye. Basically, the minimum movement. You want this number to be such that you don't let your guiding lines stray so far away from their midline that you get bad guiding. You also don't want the number to be so low that you cause overshoots in your auto guiding. So if you have a min-mo at 0, it's going to see 0 movement and start trying to correct 0 error, you know what I mean? So you want this number not too big, not too small, but just right so that deviations above the seeing, when they start reflecting into, your real guiding errors, get handled as soon as possible. So for me in my setup, I've determined that that value should be 0.11 for each. One common thing you can do to help prevent overshoots in the DEC axis, again, which is the polar alignment axis, is keep a slightly higher min-mo. For example, if your polar alignment error is really, really good, you might only need a correction in DEC once every 2 minutes or so, every minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And if you're making corrections and time scales smaller than that, then you're probably just correcting on the seeing, and that's a sign that potentially your minimum movement is too low, and you should increase it a little bit so that you can just let the DEC line do its thing in the seeing, and then once the DEC line starts to diverge, because it should be moving in a linear line with the slope, once it starts to diverge out of a reasonable threshold, which will be dependent on your system, it will come back down to the midline. So this is just a measure of how much do you want to attempt to guide on the seeing, what's your sampling, do you get sharp exposures if you're not correcting enough? If you need to be correcting more, then you can bring the min-mo down and it's going to respond to changes faster. The question that is relevant to you is how fast is too fast? What's your seeing like? You don't want to be guiding on the seeing because guiding on the seeing is mostly a losing battle. And for the DEC line also has aggression, and you're going to want to keep this ideally kind of low, again, because we're trying to prevent overshoots, especially in DEC where we see backlash. So keep your aggression low and your min-mo a little bit higher for DEC, as long as your polar alignment error is good, which it should be good to start with, or else you've got some bigger problems in figuring out your auto guiding. One other thing I haven't discussed is your mount balance and how that's going to impact your guiding. So if your mount is heavily off balance, what you're going to notice is in the RA axis, your line is primarily going to be making pulses in one direction because it's trying to account for the extra pressure that's put on your gears, manifesting itself as a bit more drift and a bit more struggle biased towards one side. And sometimes that can actually be a really good thing. If you very slightly off balance your mount in the proper way, which should be east heavy, I think, you can get better auto guiding that way because you will essentially kind of bias your corrections to one side, and it's easier to deal with than switching directions in your guiding. It's not necessary to do with all mounts. In fact, I don't really recommend doing it too much because if you balance east heavy and you meridian flip, then you're going to be balanced heavy in the wrong way, the way you don't want to be. And if you're asleep while you're imaging like me, then that's straight up a no-go. So in general, I kind of don't recommend you balance east heavy because you're going to be balanced west heavy after you meridian flip. And if you don't want that, then you should just leave it normal where it is and deal with the guiding errors as they are. You know what I mean? The last two parameters are, of course, the max DEC and the max RA, and that's simply the maximum pulse that your auto guider can give to your system. And you can just leave these as their defaults. If you're going with bigger corrections than those defaults of 2500, then something is very, very wrong with your telescope and you should probably go outside and pick it off the ground because it's most likely fallen over or worse. The one other setting I haven't discussed, of course, is the exposure time that you should be using for your autoguider. And this is something that can wildly differ between all kinds of setups, and it's all dependent on your seeing. I mentioned this earlier, but the longer your exposure, the more you average out seeing effects in your auto-guiding image. So if my star is going like all crazy and stuff, if I take a long exposure, I encompass all of that error into a slightly blurrier star, which is easier to auto-guide on than the thing that's bouncing all over the place. So a longer exposure will allow you to get smoother guiding, but it also means that you're less responsive to fast errors, and that is a big trade-off. So the advantage of multi-star guiding is that you can actually use these shorter exposures and collectively average the position of a bunch of stars going crazy all over the place and still get a smooth graph while maintaining your rapid responsiveness to sudden errors that might pop up, which can be pretty important, with all kinds of mechanical problems in your mount. If your PEC is so bad that you need a fast response, then you may need a short exposure to deal with that PEC. Something like a harmonic drive mount, that becomes very, very critical to have the short exposures to have a rapid response to a rapidly changing graph. For other mounts, you may not need a short exposure at all. Like if you're using a 10 micron, you could probably auto guide with 20-second exposures, and it's not gonna be really relevant for you to guide with very fast ones. So keep the seeing in mind. There are some very weird setups, like if you're using an active optics unit, you can technically drop your auto guiding exposure down below a second and get better guiding if you're able to respond that quickly. But for most people, you won't be using an AO, and that's not even going to be a question. So for the average person out there, I would recommend sticking between 0.5 to probably 3 seconds on average. If you're using a mount with a fast periodic error, stick to 0.5, and otherwise you're going to want to probably rock around 2 and 3 seconds. That's what I usually settle on as being my best guide exposures. So anyways, I hope you found this helpful if you're confused about PHD2, and I hope this gives you some ideas as to trying to get the best auto guiding graph possible. The one thing I would caution to everyone is that if you're getting sharp stars on your exposures, you don't gain anything by sitting and watching your graph. I don't watch my PHD2 graphs anymore. It just sits in the background because I set my settings up once and I forget it. And as long as my exposures are sharp, then it's irrelevant to me what's happening on the graph. So enjoy your imaging. Don't stare at graphs for too long, and turn your auto guiding off and just watch what your error is. Get a feel for it, you know what I mean? So those are the things I would recommend to you. If you have any questions about auto guiding, feel free to drop it in the comments. I did used to be a controls engineer, so I feel like I'm partially qualified to answer any kinds of questions that pop up. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one.